or two ways of, okay. I just got the recording announcement there. Yes, so two ways of looking at coastal Gothic. And if it appears from the rather contrasting novels on the screen here that there isn't much other connection between the two, it's because there isn't really. I'm drawing from two separate projects for tonight's talk, and let that be a lesson to all of us, never to say yes to writing two chapters for different books at the same time. But yes, I'll draw the connections between these books in terms of these two possible ways that we might think about coastal Gothic. So to begin with, coasts are interesting from a Gothic perspective because they have some distinctive qualities that ally with Gothic thinking. Coastlines are supposedly boundaries that protect what's inside, and yet nevertheless they're easily breached. Shores are unstable zones. I'm thinking particularly seashores here rather than freshwater. If we think about whether it's a beach, a rocky shore, or a cliff, these shores are constantly changing, either with every tide or under the more gradual processes of the erosion of water and weather. Shores are liminal, transitional zones. They're neither solid dry land nor permanently liquid. More constructively, they are places of desire and danger. They're sites of shipwreck. They're home to liminal beings, whether biological or mythical or both. Some of you hopefully had a chance to read Jimmy Packham's article on the Gothic coast, published in 2019, in which he highlights exactly these points. The coast is a place, he writes, of, I quote, in betweenness, an unstable amalgam of land and sea, whose tidal comings and goings have helped consolidate its reputation as a liminal space and limit, culturally and environmentally. It is both a powerful site of identity and the space in which identity is seemingly most threatened. Packham also observes that the coast has long stood as key locale in Gothic writing and is a neglected feature of the Gothic tradition. So these are the kinds of ideas that I want to explore in Northern Colour and the Castle of Otranto. In the Haunted Shores Research Network more broadly, which Jimmy and I co-convene with Joan Passy and Julia Champion, we hold there that there's a fundamental relationship on a number of levels between the Gothic and coasts. Some of you perhaps attended Joan Passy's Gothic session on Cornish Gothic, and her monograph does demonstrate that relationship really clearly. So I hope what I'll talk to you today will kind of give you a flavour of how we might approach the Gothic and the coast. The reason I've cast this as two ways of thinking about it is that I think quite a lot of the time when reading a coastal representation, we're often asking, what's Gothic about this coast? But we can also turn it the other way and ask, what's coastal about this Gothic? And that's the reason I'm going to begin with the Castle of Otranto. The Castle of Otranto may not necessarily be the most obvious coasty example in the Gothic canon, compared to perhaps Melmoth the Wanderer or Dracula, for example. But I think that's precisely why we should ask the question about what the coast has to do with it. The novel, of course, I'm going to assume a degree of familiarity with the Castle of Otranto as we go, although we'll try and contextualize the main examples in the plot. So this novel, of course, establishes numerous Gothic tropes that inform the development of the genre hereafter, especially in the European context. And one of those tropes is to fight castles on the coast. We see this again in Radcliffe and other settings in later Gothic. So the coastal setting is far from incidental to Walpole's novel. It doesn't normally get talked a great deal about, but it is worth thinking about more seriously than it generally has been. And perhaps if we can trace the significance of the coast and the sea more generally in Otranto, might that shift our understanding of the development of the subsequent Gothic tradition as a genre tradition, perhaps more dependent on seas and voyages and coastal weather, water and landscapes at a fundamental level. Okay, and then for the second part of the talk, which will be probably shorter than the Otranto part, I'm drawing on work about coast and Scottish literature, and in this case specifically in the novel Northern Colour, published in the mid-1990s. And it's set in two coastal locations, the town of Oban on Scotland's west coast and the Mediterranean and what is presumably Ibiza, although none of the locations in this book are actually named as such. Here I'm asking how Morven's experiences on the coast and in the sea relate to the rest of the novel's cultural concerns, and how applying a Gothic conception of coastal zones might further unlock some of the novel's elisions and ambiguities, which I'll explain more about when we get to that. Okay, so I'll start with Castle of Otranto. Otranto is, get to my next slide, it's sparse on descriptions of setting, but nevertheless it's quite clear that it is set on the coast. There's few direct mentions of the coast, but one of them is this one, given by Matilda to Theodore as she helps him escape his imprisonment by Manfred. If you don't know the novel, then Theodore is the secret rightful heir to Otranto and the love interest of the two princesses, of which Matilda is one. So here, to aid Theodore's escape, Matilda explains that yonder behind that forest to the east is a chain of rocks, followed into a labyrinth of caverns that reach to the sea coast. There thou mayst lie concealed till thou canst make signs to some vessel to put on shore and take thee off. Matilda's account here of the coastal caverns as a hiding place, also as a launch point, constructs the seacoast as a porous boundary, a secretive space, a means by which intruders might come and go unseen. Like Matilda herself, the coast is a weak point in Manfred's security as Prince of Otranto. Otranto and its surrounds are riddled with convenient vaults and caverns that allow characters to escape and identities to be mistaken in the darkness. The castle's layout and architecture is never precisely set out for us by Walpole, and it's even possible that Matilda's labyrinth may be connected to the castle itself. In the second quotation here, the distinction between the rocks beyond the forest and the castle vaults is blurred in the language when we compare Matilda's words to the experience of Isabella, to the narrator's telling of the experience of Isabella much earlier in the story when she's fleeing Manfred. And she finds her way into the caverns. So the lower part of the castle was hollowed into several intricate cloisters. An awful silence reigned throughout those subterranean regions, except now and then some blasts of wind that shook the doors she had passed, which, grating on the rusty hinges, were re-echoed through that long labyrinth of darkness. So here, with cloisters hollowed rather than built and leading directly to subterranean regions, it's hard to say where the castle ends and the underground begins. Perhaps even there is no boundary. Where do these blasts of winds come from? Is it damp salt air, perhaps, that has encouraged the corrosion of the hinges? Does this labyrinth of darkness even connect with Matilda's labyrinth of caverns, which are likewise hollowed out of the rocks, leading to the sea? The characters are not shown to access one labyrinth from the other, and Theodore never reaches the coast. He kind of reluctant to leave Matilda and his newly discovered father. He loiters, exploring the caves. But nevertheless, there are parallels here between the castle and the sea caverns. Both contribute to the novel's atmosphere and affect the moves of the plot by what they facilitate the characters to be able to do in these spaces. Okay, so to take a step back to the wider setting of Otranto, Walpole clearly made a point of situating his Gothic story on the coast of Italy. So the locations here that matter I've circled here. So the novel suggests that the location of Otranto is somewhere near Naples. We know from the preface that that's where the manuscript was, allegedly printed, and we know that Theodore arrives at Naples, and after wandering for 6 days, kind of ends up in the province of Otranto. So somewhere around Naples. The other important locations are Sicily, where Theodore originally comes from, and Algiers, which I'll come back to later on. And lastly, the final circle is a real Otranto. In the 1780s, Walpole, according to one of his editors, was delighted to discover that there really was a castle at Otranto, a port town on the northeast coast in Puglia, and which gave its name to a stretch of water, the Strait of Otranto. So this detail of where the real Otranto is isn't relevant, I think, to the story, but what it does demonstrate is a sort of convergence of castles, real and imagined. I don't think it's coincidence that Walpole chose a coastal castle for a story that deals with the world on the cusp of change from old to new. In Castle of Otranto, superstition, the marvellous meet enlightenment, rationalism, Whig politics struggle with a feudal past, entrenched tyranny gives way to the rightful rulership of a new generation, and the unruly medieval maritime world is about to be brought into line by the modern vessels, naval powers, and commercial networks of the 18th and 19th century. Finally, the ultimate resolution to Otranto's plot depends upon a network of voyages between Sicily, Algiers, and Naples. And the most important figure in that network is Theodore, arguably the most watery character in the book. So Theodore, as it turns out, grew up on a pirate ship. After being stolen as a child from Sicily and taken to Algiers with his mother, he has been slave to a pirate since he was 5 years old. And I don't think enough has been made really of the swashbuckling potential of Castle of Otranto, but maybe somebody could someday. And as Cleary's note at the bottom there indicates, this raid and the kidnapping are historically plausible in context of the medieval historical setting of the story. Theodore making these voyages, Italy, Algiers, on specified cruises within the Mediterranean and ultimately back to Sicily and thence to Naples. So having been kidnapped as a child and effectively raised by a pirate, 2 years before the action of the novel starts, Theodore was freed by the captain of a Christian vessel who took him home to Sicily, only to find his father gone and the family estate burned to the ground. Sailing from Sicily, Theodore journeys to Naples, and while seeking his father and generally wandering about, kind of ends up in Otranto in Manfred's principality. So this network of voyages implies to bring Theodore to the one place he needs to be, at Otranto, the place where he is the rightful heir. So the connections between the coast, these voyages over the sea, is clearly very integral to the plot. But even before Theodore's maturity, the sea was at work in the plot of Otranto even before that. These details we only discover right at the novel's end, where Manfred confesses the full extent of the series of crimes that led to his unrightful inheritance of the principality. And Theodore's father, Jerome, picks up the rest of the story. So what we learn from Manfred right at the end is that Alfonso, the original ruler of the castle and the grandfather of Theodore, did not die in battle in the Crusades, as everyone had always thought. Instead, Manfred tells us Alfonso died by poison. A fictitious will declared Ricardo his heir. However, Ricardo's crimes pursued him. A storm overtook him. Haunted by his guilt, he vowed to St. Nicholas to found a church and 2 convents if he lived to reach Otranto. The sacrifice was accepted. The saint appeared to him in a dream and promised that Ricardo's posterity should reign in Otranto until the rightful owner should be grown too large to inhabit the castle. So I think some of the language here is interesting. Ricardo is pursued by his crimes and overtaken by a storm. The storm here becomes the agent of vengeance, putting Ricardo in fear of his life until he takes steps to redress his wrongs, albeit taking it down the road 2 generations later. And even before that, when Father Jerome picks up the tale from Manfred, he explains what happened to Alfonso before he even got to the Holy Land. When he set sail, he was driven by a storm to the coast of Sicily. The other vessel was separated from him, and for 3 months, Lord Alfonso was windbound in Sicily. Here he meets Victoria, the mother of Theodore, and that's how the line is continued. So we have these 2 crucial storms, which I think are quite interesting. So what to make of these details? On one level, like the Crusades themselves, the sea makes for kind of easy plot contrivance. Voyages, not to mention pirates, are easy ways to get characters from place to place, and storms are easy reasons to keep them there. But Otranto is a novel entirely built on a contrived plot and implausible events, from the falling helmet that crushes Conrad onwards to various other supernatural portents. So in that context, do not the novel's voyages and storms deserve a serious consideration of its flying portraits, trembling plumes, and the convenient rays of illuminating moonlight? Otranto is a novel in which the marvellous is allowed to exist without being explained away. And in that light, these two storms don't strike me as entirely natural storms, but perhaps part of the older, marvelous, superstitious worldview that a lot of the novel seems to espouse. In his preface to the second edition, very famously, Walpole explained that his novel was, I quote, an attempt to blend the two kinds of romance, the ancient and the modern. In the former, all was imagination and improbability. In the latter, nature is always intended to be copied with success. So it seems to me that the two storms belong to the ancient side, the side of improbability. The first storm is evidently interpreted by Ricardo as a warning and leads him to accept the saint's prophecy. The saint's promise thus connects the storm with the other marvellous portents that precede Manfred's downfall. That includes the falling helmet, the sign portrait, and the fluttering plumes on the helmet that, interestingly, always produce a wind described as a tempest. A tempest of wind rose behind Manfred at one point, caused by the fluttering of the plumes. This tempestuous language to describe the winds is suggestive, linking these windy portents that foreshadow Manfred's doom, a doom that is arriving by sail in the form of Theodore and his last journey to Naples. The second storm, Alfonso's Sicilian storm, must have been pretty keen on keeping Alfonso and Victoria together as long as possible to keep going for 3 months. Suggests a little bit of the hand of fate, perhaps the hand of the author, ensuring continuation of Alfonso's line despite the murder that awaits him once he journeys on. So Alfonso's getting trapped by the storm in Sicily. There's no suggestion in the text that Alfonso was shipwrecked, but the effect is similar. He kind of may as well have been shipwrecked on this shore, is kind of driven there. Either way, he's been unexpectedly driven by the storm to an unknown shore where he didn't intend to be. So some of Jo Pass's comments on shipwreck, I think, have a useful bearing on this. She makes the point, and this is in Cornish Gothic, that while a successful journey could embody man's dominion over the natural world, a shipwreck embodies the opposite, its failure and the ultimate threat of tempestuous and antagonistic natural forces. So in this light, although Alfonso isn't shipwrecked, he nevertheless is defeated by the storm. He fails to ride it out. He's forced to seek harbour, indicating his weakness, his failure in the face of these natural forces. Later on, this is borne out when he loses his life to the stronger Ricardo. Ricardo himself succeeds in riding out the storm and getting successfully home to Otranto, despite being dogged by his guilt in the form of the storm. Alfonso's weakness, Alfonso's failure must be then put right in the future by his descendants, that is Theodore. But in the meantime, Ricardo's strong hand governs Otranto. So from this perspective, the two storms become part of a scheme in which correcting politics, so that is installing the young Theodore, who represents rightful governance in the place of the tyrannical Manfred. This correction of politics is embedded in the natural order, symbolized by the storms. Alfonso's storm ensures Theodore's conception, essentially, and Ricardo's storm secures the path by which he can attain his destiny. So these two storms is part of that older, more marvelous worldview. So these two marvelous and portentous storms are later contrasted with the ease by which Theodore, after he's freed from the pirate, sails untroubled to Sicily and then again to Naples. Once he's freed from the pirate by the Christian vessel, at this point he starts to be able to direct his own path and make his own decisions, suggesting a Whiggish Christian liberty contrasted with both heathen slavery and Manfred's tyranny. The meeting of old and new in the novel has been mapped by critics onto the 18th century political situation and the opposition of Whig politics over the older Tory royalism. For some critics, the novel's ending, where Theodore, the heir of Alfonso, is restored, the ending still seems entirely undemocratic because authority is still left invested in an undisputed head of state. For other critics, Walpole's story is a way of affirming Whig rulership as the rightful way to rule by securing it as destined and legitimate without revolution, a sort of fictional effort to paper over what Nick Groom has described as, I quote, all the repressed that hung behind the Gothic myth like a nightmare, all that slaughter driving the granting of liberties, all that blood oiling the process of the Constitution, end quote. Theodore's melancholy grieving over Matilda right to the final words of the novel may then suggest an acknowledgement and processing of past violence rather than its repression. The sea, I think, can kind of help add a bit of extra context to the ambivalence of the end of the novel. Passy has also remarked that, quoting again, the sea is both mystery and opportunity, key to and representative of imperial development, yet bearing the threat of reverse colonization and imperial fall, end quotes. While she is writing this in the 19th century context, the way that the sea speaks to both constant changeability and the potential for securing or extending power applies to Otranto as well. Theodore's association with the sea is arguably in keeping with the ambivalence of the novel's ending. He too is both mystery and opportunity, threatening the status quo while also securing the future of established power. Okay. I'm going to stop there on Otranto to leave a bit of time for the second book, but I've hopefully shown some of the potential ways in which the coastal context of Otranto is closely bound up with core concerns of the narrative. Okay. Right. So Morven Colour, this is another quite ambiguous novel, and so this is where I'm taking the second approach, kind of asking how Gothic lens might help to read the ambiguities of this book. I don't know how familiar anyone is likely to be with this particular novel. It's possible that you may have seen the film, Lynn Ramsey's film from 2002, I think, which takes a slightly different approach to the plot and to Morven as a character. Anyway, Morven Colour is a 21-year-old working class woman. The novel is set in a town that's referred to as the Port, but it's demonstrably the town of Oban on the west coast of Scotland. And this is very visible through very specific local detail. You know, you can see the places in Oban very clearly in this setting. So the plot is more or less about Morven's efforts to escape or transcend the kind of economic entrapments of a working class life. But she does that in often quite unexpected ways. As a character, she's very, very taciturn, she's very silent. She never reflects for us on her feelings, she never explains her motivations. She's very associated with silence, and she learns part of the way through the novel that her name, Colour, means silence or to say nothing. So instead of being able to sympathize and understand with the kind of psychological interiority of Morven, readers are instead faced with the challenge of making sense of her behavior through a consistently surface-focused narration. And some of the interesting watery Gothic qualities of this book are about that contrast or interrelation between surface and depth in how the novel is narrated. For Duncan Petrie, who's written about the book, he suggests that Morven, I quote, is more attuned to the sensations and surface details that comprise the substance of her world, be it painting her nails, smoking a cigarette, or recording compilations of music, than exploring or conveying her emotions. The substance of Morven's world, these surface details and sensations that she tells us about in intense detail, but without this kind of depth of reflection on what they mean to her. These include numerous encounters with water. That includes rain, snow, baths, a swimming pool, a mountain river, and of course, the sea. We might take, I think, the cover of this edition of Warner's novel as illustrating the night swimming scene, a scene I'm going to talk about in a bit. In water, Morven has some of her most powerful experiences, of which I think the night swimming scene is the most important. So I don't think Petrie is entirely correct. Morven is attuned to her emotions. She just refuses to tell us about them. And refusing to explain herself wouldn't necessarily be such a problem if Morven didn't do so many puzzling things that appear to this reader anyway to require explanation. It could be quite a frustrating read because, you wanted to say more, but she won't. So, for example, at the very start of the novel, when she finds her boyfriend dead on the floor of her flat, she just leaves him there and gets ready to go to a party. She doesn't phone the police. A little while later, she pulls him up into the loft, and in the cold of the winter, he kind of stays there, kept cool. And then a few months later in the summer, she sort of dismembers his collapsing body and buries the pieces in the mountains. So there's a lot of actions that Morven takes that mark her as a transgressive character for a lot of readers, and that includes, I suppose, what amount to transgressions against, a middle class reader's social rules and expectations. And those include the expectations of her former boyfriend. He's middle class, she's working class, and his suicide note that he leaves to her kind of seems to expect of her social climbing aspirations that Morven just doesn't possess. Her values are in very different places. Rachel Carroll, this is the critic of one of the readings I've suggested, has some useful comments to make about this. She points out that when Morven inherits her boyfriend's father's money, instead of carefully marshalling it against the long-term future, Morven instead, I quote, uses these funds to purchase commodities of great value to her as a young working woman, time and leisure. Carroll continues, when viewed from a class perspective defined by restraint, Morven's pursuit of pleasure liberated from economic constraints would seem personally profligate and financially irresponsible. She does not invest in property nor aspire to social mobility. She makes no attempt to trade in her class identity, and indeed her generosity to both friends and fellow service industry workers seems motivated by a sense of class solidarity. Morven's spending is also suggestive of a defiance of the economy of profit. In a sense, she destroys capital by spending it in ways which deprive it of its personal accumulative potential, end quote. Morven's most notorious transgression is when she puts her own name to the novel her boyfriend has written and sends it away to a publisher. So not only does she have a different idea of what's worth doing with money, she has a different idea to the kinds of culture more associated with an educated middle class that her boyfriend belongs to. So she, essentially steals his intellectual property and gains credit for the publication of this novel, as well as the money associated with, the advance and the sale of the book. But she doesn't value this form of culture. To her, this novel thing was page after page of words, then a number, then more pages of words, and another number. You had to read it all to get to the end. You couldn't see the point in reading through all that just to get to an end. It's one of my favorite quotations from the book. I think it's really funny. So I will get to the coast eventually, I promise. where I'm going with this is to think about what the scenes on the coast and in the water, how they relate to Morven's identity as this transgressive figure. And I also want to suggest that Morven's relationship with water and experiences of water are very akin to her experiences with music. I'll just go on to this. I'm going to get to this scene in a minute, but you'll see in the second paragraph there that as she goes out into the snow on this particular dark morning, this is like December, she's listening to music, and she's often making compilations, listening to music all the time, and the soundtrack is very important to how she kind of is in the world. So Georgia Walker Churchman, in another really insightful argument on this book, argues that, I'm quoting, Morven's ambivalence towards literature stands in marked contrast to the other art forms celebrated throughout the novel, music, particularly in Acid House. It is this form of culture that is represented as offering Morven a genuine mode of engagement. And it is precisely these forms of culture that the mainstream cultural politics of the era were least able to deal with. Throughout the novel, House, unlike the production of the novel, threatens the limits of ownership, land rights, and bodily autonomy. The dance scenes in the novel reel as a celebration of unlegislated for creativity. Churchman goes on, I read Morven Colour as a satire on the notion that politically and socially sanctioned forms of cultural capital can elevate an individual's subjectivity. Churchman reads this through the dance scenes, and I'll show you an example of one of those in a bit so that you can kind of see why it aligns so closely with Morven's experience in water. So I'm thinking about Morven's activities in water, including the night swimming, which we'll come to in a minute, as forms of unsanctioned elevation of subjectivity. That her transgressiveness is partly in terms of behaviour that doesn't follow middle-class expectations, and partly about the potential for political disruption, the dissolution of the self, whether that's in music or in water. So I'm going to give two examples. The second one is the night swimming from right at the end of the novel, and its position in the narrative is important. The example that you should be looking at right now is from quite early on in the novel. It's early on a December morning, and it's a good example of Morven doing something unexpected and puzzling that she doesn't explain to us. Why does she engage in this particular behaviour with regards to the sailor on the boat? She doesn't reflect or explain this for us, but you can see what you think. I'd like to read these passages properly to you, but I don't have the accent for it. I'm going to pull out a few details instead, and hopefully you'll find time to read this through. So yeah, so Morven, it's dark, it's nighttime, she's standing on the coast, it snows on the ground, and the boat comes around the corner, and the sailor there stares at her. And this scene, there are sometimes sort of almost kind of mythical qualities to how Morven is represented. She sort of becomes more than a real person and seems to kind of function on a more mythic level. And here she kind of seems to be a kind of folkloric, bad luck figure. And this is, perhaps how she's received as this surprising girl in black that's standing out against the snow. I suppose he thought I was bad luck or something, because a girl in black, like the dark water around his boat and the wet rocks where the saltiness had melted the snow. Quickly I lifted the little black number to show him the pale skin above the ladder stockings with the black lines of straps on my thigh. He felt the cold knit more. The boat, mistyped that. The boat moved into the bay till its engine was gone, the man still looking back as the wash melted snow of the rocks with a hiss. I'll cover myself up, then use the goldish lighter on the silk cut. This is a good example of kind of the level of very detailed surface description that Morven gives us without this underlying explanation. And there's these series of incidents that Morven has with water seem to be marks of progression. As she's kind of, I guess, struggling to find herself, and where eventually she finds herself is in the Mediterranean resorts, where her encounters with music and water become more intense. I continue to find this book and the writing very puzzling, so I'm still very much thinking my way through what I think about these passages, and be delighted with any reflections that you might want to share later on. Okay, the night swimming scene. This is a really long, really evocative scene. It's about 4 pages and really worth reading in full if you can get hold of a copy of the novel. So Morven, having inherited money from her dead boyfriend, has gone back to Ibiza and is kind of basically spending it on rave parties and hotels. But she, for reasons that she doesn't explain, decides to do something quite dangerous, which is go and swim at nighttime. And it's not, as you see, it's not an easy coast for her to get in and out of. It's a very rocky coast, clear volcanic rock. It's like the coast had melted and then gone hard again. Skulls and blobs of rock. Dark in the moonlight. She's got a battle against the water, the surge of the waves that are fighting her. She's getting in and out of the coast. The difficult bit for Morven is that transition from the rocks into the sea. Once she's actually in the water, she has quite a different experience. But it's a good example of the way Morven never does things by halves. She's always kind of pushing for more and more extreme experiences. And we see here a good example of that. She's, heart rate is high. She's anxious about what she's doing, but she's so keen to gain these intense experiences of living that she persists. Later on in the scene, we get a strong sense of how Morven's awareness of depth is refracted through how she thinks about the way her body feels in the water. In the middle paragraph here, she dives under the surface. We get a strong sense of this disorientation and the kind of almost the loss of some of her bodily and respiratory limits in relation to the water that she's in. Later on, she manages to scare herself. She realizes, I suppose, the danger, the risk of what she's doing. I started the swimming in. You notice how my heart was racing. I was swimming with faster and heavy sweeping pulls of the arms. Once my cupped hand broke surface as I pulled back a stroke, and it was the splash that sounded like panic. I hissed in a breath and kicked harder. And so Morven would never admit to us that she felt frightened. She wouldn't comment on feelings like that, and the emotional indicatings are always kind of displaced onto something else. So she's not panicked. The splash sounds panicked, and there's quite a lot of moments like that where she deflects an intense feeling onto some other details as a kind of distraction. She emerges from the sea, and again, there's a sense of the loss of clear limits between her body and the environment. The moon shines equally off her shining wet skin and the round wet stones as she emerges from the water. So just to end there, the first quotation is an example of Morven's immersion in dance. And there are some similarities here with her body's interaction with the music, immersed, very similar to the way that she is in the sea earlier on. And the second quotation is right at the very end of the chapter about the night swimming. Turned facing the sea, I heard a drip come off my hair. I closed my eyes there in the quietness, just breathing in and breathing in. I hadn't slept for 3 days, so I could know every minute of that happiness that I never even dared dream I had the right to. So the night swimming scene is a strong moment in kind of Morven's search for her own kind of happiness, which she attains in her own unique way, really. But the money runs out, and she's forced to return to the port, penniless, in need of work, pregnant, all of this. But nevertheless, she's found a kind of centeredness that she lacks at the start of the novel, and so the story ends. Okay, so that's a few examples from Morven Colour. As I say, I'm still thinking my way through all of this, so some of what I've said still feels rather sketchy to me, and any reflections you might have, I'm interested in hearing about. But I'm interested in the way that in a novel that isn't overall Gothic, that there are these strong moments of participation in a very Gothic way